This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to Configuring Windows Domain Authentication, also known as Desktop Single Sign-On. This is the first of 3 videos in this series. The purpose of this course is to take an in-depth look at configuring Windows Domain Authentication. So let's take a look at what we'll be covering. In our first video, we're going to start off with a basic overview of the feature and how it works, and do a quick refresher on installing the Active Directory connector, which is the key component that needs to be in place for Windows Domain Authentication to work. In the second video, we'll look at the main configuration steps necessary to put Windows Domain Auth into place. And in our final video, we'll look at how to configure Windows Domain Authentication for load balancing and cover a few troubleshooting tips. First, let's take a look at what exactly Windows Domain Authentication is. Let's answer a few basic questions. First, what is Windows Domain Authentication, which is also known as WDA, or Desktop Single Sign-On, and Desktop SSO. There was a recent name change from Desktop SSO, so it's always good to know previous names and current names. Then, we'll take a look at how WDA works. Then, how it affects a user's experience. Finally, we want to compare it to another OneLogin product, OneLogin Desktop, that actually gives the end user a very similar experience when they log into the OneLogin portal. So it's easy to get OneLogin Desktop and Windows Domain Authentication confused. It was even easier to get them confused when WDA was referred to as Desktop Single Sign-On. So first, simply put, WDA allows users to log into the OneLogin portal from their Windows Domain joined workstations without having to provide a username and password. The key is to understand that it can only be enabled through Active Directory Directory Services configuration with OneLogin. So each Active Directory configuration can be configured to sync all users from within a particular Active Directory forest. If you want to enable it for users from multiple forests, you'll have to configure a two-way transitive trust between the Active Directory forests. Finally, you can configure the authentication request to be load balanced between our Active Directory connector instances. Again, these are the installations of the software that we use to sync with Active Directory, and you can install these on more than one server. Therefore, you can load balance this process between those servers. And here we're seeing OneLogin admin UI, and in this particular account, we actually have 2 Active Directory connectors configured. Only one of these connectors, like the one I'm pointing to with that arrow, can be configured to handle this Windows Domain Authentication process. So, how does Windows Domain Authentication work? Well, the basic auth flow looks like this. A user's logged into their domain joined workstation, and they open a browser and navigate to their OneLogin domain, your subdomain.onelogin.com. From there, OneLogin detects the IP address the request is coming from. It's that public IP address that workstation appears as. And if the IP address is within a predefined range that you've configured, OneLogin will send a request through the Active Directory connector, which is that squiggly line there, over to the domain controller, where it's going to verify that the user's logged in with their AD credentials. So it's using Integrated Windows Authentication, or IWA. So as long as it's able to validate that Integrated Windows Authentication, then it's going to generate a JWT or JSON Web Token, and send that request over to OneLogin. And OneLogin will automatically log the user in. Let's see how it works so that we understand what we're working towards. All right, let's take a look at how Windows Domain Authentication looks like or behaves to an actual end user. So I'm logged into a workstation, part of my Active Directory domain, logged in with domain credentials as Miss Gloria Arias here, as you can see in my command prompt. And again, I already have my Active Directory connector set up. I already have Windows Domain Authentication configured. So as an end user, I am going to go to OneLogin. That's where I got to get access to what I need to do my job. So I'm just going to open up my browser here. I'm going to type in my OneLogin URL, hit enter, and the magic actually just kind of occurs. If you kind of paid attention to it up there, the URL at one point changed to point to my DC that has one of my Active Directory connectors onto it, and then double check, make sure I'm logged in as Windows user, and voila, I'm logged in now to my OneLogin portal. Did not have to specify my username or password. Now, if multi-factor authentication had been required for me as part of my policy and WDA had been configured to make sure we were supporting that policy, I would have been prompted for my MFA. But without any MFA requirements in place, I was simply automatically logged into, again, the OneLogin portal because I'd already logged into my Windows desktop with my Windows credentials. And just so you don't get confused, let's do a little comparison between OneLogin Desktop, which actually comes in two flavors, a basic version and a pro version, and Windows Domain Authentication. They are all very similar in that they allow a user to log into the OneLogin portal without having to provide their username and password, like we just saw in a demo there. But the big differences are, A, you have to pay for OneLogin Desktop. Windows Domain Authentication is free. It's part of the base plan. Also, you have to install software on a client's system for OneLogin Desktop to work. Windows Domain Authentication doesn't involve installing anything on the client systems. And then last but not least, main difference is OneLogin Desktop works on standalone systems. WDA requires that the desktops the users are logging in from are part of an Active Directory domain. Now that we have a basic understanding of what WDA does, let's take a look at how to enable it. WDA works through the Active Directory connector software you install when you're configuring OneLogin to sync with Active Directory directory services. During installation of the Active Directory connector software, or ADC software, there is a step where you can specify a port that you want the client machines to use when communicating with that ADC instance, or that installation of Active Directory during authentication. The default port is 8080, which works well if you only have that ADC software installed on one machine within your Active Directory environment. Best practice, of course, is to have the software installed on more than one machine for load balancing and failover purposes. Then, in order to enable load balancing for WDA, you need SSL enabled. So, you want the port to be 443. Therefore, best practice, making that port 443. Don't worry if you've already installed your Active Directory connector software and kept the default port as 8080. You can change it a little later on. We'll take a look at this when we show you how to fully configure that SSL functionality when you're configuring WDA. A few more things to keep in mind to make sure all of this is going to work. So again, have to have those Active Directory connectors installed, and they should be running ADC 5 or later. That's basically what's available, so that shouldn't be all that hard at this point. Second, You cannot install the Active Directory connector software on domain controllers. Now, if this were a standalone, yes, you could. But because we are working towards configuring that load balancing and we need to enable SSL, the Active Directory connector software should only be installed on member servers, not on domain controllers. Finally, make sure your browsers are configured to allow NTLM or enabled for Kerberos if you have Mac devices that are joined to your Active Directory domains. So, just in case you haven't gone through installing the Active Directory connector, let's do a quick refresher of installing the ADC. We would recommend that you go through the documentation on installing the Active Directory connector or watch the Installing and Configuring Active Directory Connector video training if you haven't already done so. All right, first things first, if you do not already have the Active Directory installed and configured, Windows Domain Authentication working depends upon having the Active Directory installed and configured. So we're going to say new directory here, and we're going to choose Active Directory. And download the Active Directory connector. This will get you the most recent one. Could change the name here, of course. We'll just call this WDA because we know this is used for Windows Domain Authentication demonstration here. And we're going to run the installation file. So again, typically already done. Only key point that we need to make sure is set up during this installation process. You can change it afterwards. We'll take a look at that, but it's going to be the port to which you can connect to that other name for Windows Domain Authentication, which is Desktop SSO. So let me go and set the password here. And here we go. So port number by default is 8080. And notice here, port 443 is required if you're configuring Desktop SSO, again, Windows Domain Authentication, to load balance between multiple Active Directory connectors. And since that's a best practice, that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to change this to 443. So that's the only configuration step that you might want to think about when you're initially setting up the Active Directory connectors, is that port to which the systems, in this case your client systems, right, your customer, your clients, workstations will be connecting to the web interface on the Active Directory connectors themselves, on the systems that you have Active Directory connector software installed on. So that's all I need to do there. In a second here, it should click to next, and we can say, synchronize so many users. We can go change this OU selection if we want to, and we'll sync all the users for the fun of it today, and click save. So again, at minimum, for Windows Domain Authentication to work, I need a single Active Directory connector instance installed, which is what we've done here. We will look at how to set it up with load balancing. So in the end, we're actually going to have two instances here. We're going to have it installed on both of them, but just a refresher here, you need to make sure the Active Directory connector is set up first. This concludes part 1 of configuring Windows Domain Authentication. Please continue on to part 2.
This is a presentation of OneLogin training.